Hi, I'm James Brookes, and welcome to From the Factory Floor, a conversational podcast about all things startup and tech, brought to you by the folks at tsf.tech. Thanks everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of From the Factory Floor. This week we're talking all about tech choices with what's seeming like a usual crowd at the moment of Eric and Aleksa.
Morning, hey guys, nice to see you again.
Yeah, hello.
See you here, whichever medium people are going for, but I'll say we are going to have to rope in Ian and Guy at some point to do these again, rather than just putting the onus on YouTube. But I don't think
it's all Guy's idea as well.
I'm not sure Ian and Guy are the best people to talk about tech choices, business choices maybe, but yeah, I don't think they'd know. I think if you mentioned Java to Guy, I think you probably start thinking about coffee. But so, like I said, this week's all about tech choices, and last week we covered off a lot about the cloud. So rather than rehashing old ground, we'll try and stay clear of that. So I guess almost as a starter for 10 chaps, you know, when it comes to tech choices, what sort of things are available? You know, as a non-techie, and obviously absorbed a little bit, but what is a tech stack?
So yeah, I guess tech choices is a bit of a vague title, isn't it?
Like, very.
Talking about all sorts of stuff today, but yeah, there's a few big things that that we're really thinking of. One is the language that we're going to choose to create our platform, application, whatever it is that we're building. So that's probably the big early choice that we need to make. And yeah, you can have more than one if you want to, I guess. But we generally think, why split your knowledge and try and, this is the best thing for the back end. It's so much faster than this thing, and then you got to use this cool new library for the front end and this wonderful language. Yeah, much better to pick one golden nugget and use it everywhere. I mean, there's plenty of languages that work across the board, aren't there, Aleksa?
Yes, yeah, absolutely agree. I think back in the old days, first thing you would ask when you have a project to build something, what are we going to build it in? And I think from my past, it usually has been only one choice because the specialization has been prevalent, really. So we are a Java development house, but we do everything in Java. Then over the years, there has been this development that you use the best tool for the job, which means you do many different languages for different bits, one for front end, one for back end, one for mobile. But as you just said, I think especially in the startup world, when we are looking to prove the product market fit, having one core language that you can use is definitely preferred option for us.
Yeah. So just as a very quick interjection, for any of the more business focused listeners out there, what when we talk about front and back end, what are we actually talking about there? Like what is a front end of an application? What's the back end?
So front end just being the bit that your users see, and the back end being everything else.
But the front end is the pretty bit, the back end makes it work.
Yeah, the back end's the bit in the cloud, which is the rude word we said we wouldn't use, and the front end's the bit on your phone or on your computer or wherever that is. The one thing that we just mentioned there, that if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting up, you're not the tech guy, but you've got this idea and you want someone to build it, you might go out and find some software houses or some people that you want to build it for you. As Aleksa said, like a lot of the time, and it's always been true where I've previously worked, you don't really choose what language to build something, and you say, well, I've got a team of Java devs, therefore we're doing it in Java. And if it so happens that you go and talk to a dev house that uses .NET, they're going to say it's best to do it in .NET. That's just the way it is, really. So if you're not the tech guy, you've just got to know that these choices are being made for you, and you've got to live with them. So, I mean, you mentioned it there. Obviously, almost the prevalence of resource to actually build these things without actually just calling people resources, which I know almost seems rude. Just say, yeah, you're just a resource. I am a man, not a number.
Yeah, that's the one. I'm more than just a number. But is that the only consideration really that you make when you? So obviously we do make decisions on tech choices for sort of our startups. What consideration do you make outside of just there's lots of Java devs in Manchester, or there's lots of Scala devs in London, for example?
So the main choice for us is probably, well, most of the time, to be honest, the language isn't that important to what's being built. A lot of the time you could build it in anything because the thing you're building isn't particularly specialized this way or that way. It's just a website. It's just an app that does some relatively simple stuff. So you can do that in anything at all and reasonably well as well. So given that, then your only reason for choosing really is to make a sensible choice of, who's available to do it. Once it's been done, who's available to extend it, support it, build it, and how expensive are those people and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess we go for something that's popular, something that's widely used, something that's easy to use. That's another thing. So I guess a lot of the time we're gonna try and recruit, a graduate from university or somebody who's not, got lots of years of experience and really specialized in anything. They're going to have to pick it up and learn it. And a lot of your team is going to be made up of relatively cheap people like that, potentially. So it needs to be something that they can pick up and go with. Whereas because I had this weird internal love of complicated thing like Haskell, and I decided to do it in that, it'd be almost impossible to get some cheap developed resource to help you out.
Yeah. I think a lot of languages that are quite popular, and you can implement anything in them, as you said. They're general purpose programming languages, isn't it, Eric? So that you can basically build anything. And the more general purpose language is, then these other considerations will come into play about complexity, the richness of the ecosystem, libraries, resources, and talent available. Maybe in some cases you will need to to build something that is very specific to some low-level feature of the particular language, where the special nature of the language would be the prevalent in choosing it, be it Scala or Haskell or something like that. But when you think about startups, it's about getting the idea back into reality, and for that, it's typically we're using general-purpose languages, and then all these other considerations become more and more important.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I briefly covered there, the general place where we start from, i.e. this JavaScript stack that works for everything and has lots of resource, etc. But when we have switched out of that, we haven't always used that. So, in a couple of startups, we've been like, okay, well, we're doing some AI now, so let's switch to Python, just because there's a lot of good AI libraries in Python, or that kind of scientific processing stuff. There's a lot more available there, so we might switch part of the stack to that just for the ease of use of the other bits.
So just to do another piece of jargon busting, when you talk about a library, I assume you're not talking about a building with lots of books in.
No, it's choosing your language is one thing, and then you've got the other bits. That's how I just phrased it, isn't it? The other bits. So even libraries isn't necessarily the right word to use. I guess that's kind of historic from the old kind of C days of static libraries and stuff like that. But some people call them packages or gems or nuggets. What else is there? There's loads of stupid names. Depending on what language you're in, they've named them differently. But it basically is just code written by other people to do particular jobs or roles. It's more often you'd probably think of most of this as open source, but it's not specifically open source necessarily. But yeah,
I'm just going to be on jargon busting patrols. I'm going to ask you what open source is in a minute.
I know, in a minute. But it covers tools and stuff like that as well, doesn't it? So yeah, it's a bit yeah. There's too much to talk about. Let's focus.
The other consideration, which I know is a massive thing at the moment with a lot of startups, is all about, obviously, when we talk about the front end and almost the bits that people interact with, is obviously mobile these days. And, we have iOS, we have Android. There's, I don't know if Huawei's got their own thing now with all the changes they've had. In terms of approaching mobile, what considerations do you have to make outside of just that? Or is there an option that spans everything when you're making an app?
Yeah, I think after an enormous push to kind of a standardization of the development platforms, to have a JVM machine and then JavaScript that runs anywhere really. Now mobile is probably threw a bit of spanner into that with a bit more fragmentation in platforms. So with main players like Apple and Google having separate platforms in iOS and Android, which are using completely different languages, tech stacks. So if you want to build something across the board, it becomes much more challenging, because you need much more skills and different approaches to solving problems, which is where, again, the community has come together to try to build something library, if you want, or frameworks or components, how you want to call them, that kind of bridge that gap, that allow you to do the single code base across the platforms. So this is where cross-platform mobile development comes into place. And I think coming back to our original thought of having a single language spanning everything, using cross-platform tools like, say, React Native, we now can do JavaScript even on the mobile side. And that sort of works in our favor.
Yeah, so for the front end there, we're talking about, classic websites, but also apps on your phone, the two different types of phone generally, but various slight variances beyond that, different sizes, but yeah.
No, so I think a lot of this, and obviously when we come down to things, when it comes to, getting the relevant people to actually build it, is almost that keep it simple approach of making sure that if you can use one language across, it is easier to recruit. And we all know the issues with recruitment at the moment. It's obviously very difficult. And then anyway, jumping forward to the point I made before, Eric, you mentioned open source. Now, you hear this word, you heard that sort of phrase bandied about. I know Netflix uses open source tools. I know we've used them in previous lives. What exactly is open source, and why is it this thing that everyone seems to hold up as a brilliant thing to have?
So open source really just means publishing your work so other people can see it. And then beyond that, it's sharing the actual thing itself, but generally for free and with, not much in the way of license constraints and stuff. So it's actually just quite easy. There's plenty of stuff out there that you can just pick up and use without worrying about it. And it's basically massively important. You couldn't build things in the modern world without it because everything's so complicated. There are so many moving parts to even relatively simple applications that if you had to create all of it from scratch yourself, forging your own steel and bending it into wires and all of that, then you'd never get anything done. So the point is you're focusing on providing the service that you're trying to provide and using the available tools to get you there quickly.
Yeah, just like the startup, they have their own USP and try to solve particular problems. So when you build the tech for such startup, you want to focus on solving that particular problem. And as much as you can reuse without compromising on quality and flexibility, extensibility, and things like that, the better for you. Obviously, there are some additional considerations to take into account as well there. When you're looking at open source, it's all very well, I guess, picking things that are available and free, and that's great, especially in the startup world, but you have to be careful in picking the right things that are maintained and have some sort of community behind them. I mean, if someone just comes up with an open source project and it's one person, and even if it's useful and good in the short term, if there is one person and they stop maintaining it a few years down the line, it will become probably a legacy and a bigger challenge to maintain within your own project as well.
And I guess that was one of the questions I was going to ask is, there's two really of, with all the open source software that's around. I remember in a previous life, Cake was all about open source software and big proponent of it. I remember at times when something that was open source was suddenly not open source, and there was issues then with, like I say, the maintenance of it. So before we so is it always is it better to build some things yourself and have that sort of that thing you've got complete control over versus getting something off the shelf or an open source product and actually using that? What is there about? I think right there.
I think it's actually quite an easy decision mostly. So there's different times. So when there's multiple packages available and you want to choose which one you want to use, that's one kind of decision. And that's, if one of them's been created by one guy and hasn't been touched in a year, you're obviously not going to pick it. You're going to pick the one that's been created by Google and has, hundreds of developers and people using it because it's going to stay up to date relatively well. Now, anything you pick, you're going to have to, you can build a piece of software once and run it, right? And it will keep running, but the world moves on. So everyone buys new phones. New phones support different things. And if you don't keep up, it's going to stop working. So you're always going to have to respond. I wouldn't be scared of picking a piece of open source code and using it, worrying about it changing in future, because the alternative is kind of worse. The alternative is you have to do it yourself. It's going to take longer, and you're still going to have to change it in future to keep up with things. now, I mean, I've done it a few times. Well, I've done it both ways, to be honest. I've built things myself when I shouldn't have, and I've used stuff. But it's certainly easier to pick something up and use something. And then if you realize it's not quite good enough down the line, you can change it down the line. It's not a problem. But you've already saved and got yourself, a year's worth of work for a lot lower input at the beginning.
Yeah, is there a bit of a challenge there, I guess, I think like the literature, all stories have been told already in the history. In the software, I mean, a lot of problems, maybe not all, have been already solved. So as an engineer, what you get to do is really pick those little parts that sort of solve part of the problem and just compose them into your own solution and make it do something else. Eric, do you think that affects a bit of motivation and challenge for developers and engineers like us who would like to solve those complex problems? I mean, maybe even though they have been solved, maybe in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of them things, isn't it? There's kind of, I nearly brought up this joke earlier in there are too many libraries, too many languages or different ways of doing things. What we need is a new one that unifies everything. So then you end up with one more. And the same is obviously true with, in the open source world. Just because there's one way of doing something doesn't mean there's a better way. There's not a better way. And somebody may try and figure that out. And as a particular engineer or something, I may decide, actually, I think I could do a better job at this. And I've certainly looked at some, the code of some of the libraries I'm using and go, actually, this is really, really shoddy. We could certainly improve on it. But then it's about, do I want to improve on it now, or what do I want to get out of it? And from that perspective, actually not just consuming open source, but creating it is kind of gives that motivation back. So you may say, actually, to build our application, we want to use, as much open source as possible. And my job then becomes a more boring, put this jigsaw puzzle together type thing, rather than write this cool low-level code. But you can then say, to your developers or whatever, you can release your own open source library on company time, maintain it for us. We'll be using it. And then they kind of get that low-level thing, but also, a lot more exposure, and it turns into a marketing piece for you as well, and all of that. So
I know Cake, again, harking back to days, also they were big proponents of open source software. Had that thing, two members of the team, it was Simon and a chap called Yako, who were, great to work with. Just in case they are listening, I don't want them to say bad things about them. I think it was some sort of Scala Kafka connector, and they used that in every project, and it became a really big thing that a lot of people started using.
Yeah. And the other one is our good friends over at Invitaser who've got the React Native Firebase library together. They look after that. That's paid for. That's massive, isn't it? Used by Google and supported by them. So there's really good things to be done in terms of getting yourself out there and actually motivating your team by giving them that little bit of freedom to publish something that they've built for your company. That makes sense.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if you guys would agree, but I mean, my view would be, if you are building a product for a startup, and if you're in that sort of, proving the product market fit, try to reuse as much as possible, really, to basically make sure you can move as fast as you can. But as soon as you have something out and proven your idea, then these sort of considerations should come into place, and maybe doing some of the things on your own, maybe with a view for open sourcing it as well, both from improving the tech overall and the product, but also from the motivational and the marketing perspective as well, as you said, Eric.
So I've got a question, probably mostly for you, Aleksa, but what do you think is the biggest problem with open source in general as like an ecosystem? Because I've got some challenges and just wondered what yours are.
Well, I think...
I've got him on the ropes here.
I was going to say, far more probing than one mine.
I mean, speaking from experience, and maybe some of the, if we ever may, and we all did make some decisions in terms of using the open source software where we maybe shouldn't have or have challenges with. I think that something we touched on before is about picking the right library, and in terms of understanding what it does. And a lot of the times we treat open source software as black boxes without really understanding what's happening inside. Although if they are open source, we could understand quite a lot about it. It's probably a bit easier not to do it. And then we get bitten by challenges down the line when you're trying to change them, understanding that the implementation is doing something very specific that we haven't accounted for.
Yeah, what I've always struggled with is actually finding things. You know,
Yeah, I was about to say next thing is Google, really, because Google doesn't point you in the right thing always.
No, but you know, you don't know what to. It's one of them problems, isn't it? So there are so many ways of putting different things together to achieve something, but what's the right way of putting it together? What things do I even need to search for? What things do I need to consider? So the kind of open source way of doing things is kind of, you know, Lego blocks. It's start with these little bits and put them together. And actually all of the good, well, most of the really good open source, you know, projects and libraries out there are really focused on doing very specific things, which means you need to get lots of them and put lots of them together rather than using one big one. There are lots of frameworks out there, you know, things like Angular and React that, you know, are for doing the bigger stuff. But
have you ever
actually learning that is hard.
Open source library just because of the one thing in it, like a small component, like a function or whatever, but that brings like loads of things with it, so it becomes like really fat thing in it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, use things like Lodash, right? It's a massive library of tiny functions. Yeah, it can be hard, but also just the kind of the learning curve of picking them up. So the bigger they get, the harder they are to learn, and therefore the less likely you are to want to pick it up to create something quickly, because it's going to take you ages to get your head around it.
I guess there is an element of a business risk with it to some extent, of using open source software, and then say the publisher then decides to actually put a license on it, just in case, you know, it's something that I've seen happen before. There's usually a bit of a kickback, and obviously you can, like you said, you can change components out and switch them. Obviously,
yeah, I mean, they can never suddenly start charging you for something that was previously free, but they could, basically there could be an update, or it could stop being updated, at which point you do need to respond. But the same, like we said earlier, the same is true of if you do stuff yourself. Yeah. You know, the platforms that you're running on will update and you need to respond to that. So actually it's better to use some open source where the chances are someone else is going to sort it out for you, and you're not going to have to deal with it.
Is there anything else you guys want to add on this? I mean, we'll do the usual and ask what your main takeaways are when it comes to tech choices, just looking at the time as always. You don't want to take up everyone's time on a commute, but when it comes to tech choices, you know, Aleksa, what'll be your one main takeaway that you'd want people to get from sort of what we've said so far?
Well, I would say that from a starter perspective, you should try to look at consistency, having to begin with less moving parts, and something we sort of mentioned a few times, a single language. If you can use it across the board, it will make your life much easier in the short and medium term when you hire your team. Yeah,
and from my point of view, then it's really to be that, I guess, if you're the founder, you're the entrepreneur, it's your company, right? You want to be making these decisions, informed decisions, kind of yourself, or you know, with help. You don't want to just let them happen by accident or happenstance and then live with the consequences. You kind of need to take a little bit of agency in it and drive it where you want, thinking about, you know, what you want from your company rather than what the suppliers want to use for their own benefit, or what the, you know, hipster CTO wants to use because it sounds cool, or whatever it is. You need to just think about it a little bit yourself. And there's a lot of really fluffy reasons, to be honest, that are more important than the hardcore tech decisions.
Yeah, I think I'd echo sort of both sentiments really, of, you know, keep it simple where you can use one tech stack, purely from getting people in who can then work on the full front and back end. And then generally, you know, you got to strike a balance between what's new, cool, and interesting. I remember when blockchain became a thing, and like we mentioned AI, but remembering that there is going to be implications and costs of finding people, obviously looking at it more from a business perspective for me, of actually doing that. So yeah, I think that's about us. I mean, I'd say, I don't know if you've got a let off next week, Aleksa, but I know Eric's still on.
No, another week.
Another week, but next week we're talking all about engineering process, so I might actually be able to add a little bit to that. So it'll be a little bit about sort of just how teams work, more from an engineering perspective than just pure agile, which I think, is then the week after. So we got actually spoiled for 2 weeks there. So thank you very much, chaps, for your time. I know this is becoming verging on routine, but I think we're getting better at it slowly.
It was good to speak to you guys. I enjoyed this.
Good. All right. Well, thank you very much, chat. Speak to you next week.
I think that just about wraps things up here. If you have any thoughts or questions on anything we said today, get in touch, whether that be through our Twitter @RealTSF or email at hello@startupfactory.tech, or feel free to drop in for a coffee and a chat. As ever, thanks for listening.